In 2010, in a quiet town in Kansas, people knew Harold and Ruby Brooks as an ordinary couple who had lived together for nearly 40 years. They were retired, lived modestly, and were often seen at the local church. Harold, 72, was known as a man of routine, quiet and polite, though somewhat withdrawn. Ruby, 68, was more outgoing, the type of person who would chat with neighbors and bring pies to community events. They had raised 2 children, both grown and long moved away. By all outward appearances, the Brookses had built the kind of life many would call uneventful, steady, and secure. But the murder that took place inside their home that year revealed an extraordinary motive, one almost too bizarre to believe. Harold had worked for decades at a local printing company where he earned enough to support his family. He was meticulous about money, almost to the point of obsession. Neighbors and family recalled how he would keep notebooks filled with handwritten records of every expense, no matter how small. A cup of coffee, a gallon of milk, a utility bill. Everything was documented in precise, careful script. Even after retirement, Harold continued this practice. It was more than habit. To Harold, it was a form of control, a way of bringing order to a world he sometimes found overwhelming. Ruby tolerated it. She used to joke about his little books, telling friends she'd long since stopped questioning the pages of figures Harold kept in his desk drawer. But underneath the humor was frustration. Ruby had always felt Harold's frugality went too far. While other couples their age took vacations or spent freely on their grandchildren, Harold resisted, insisting that every dollar needed to be tracked, every purchase justified. Tensions rose, particularly when Ruby wanted to update the house or buy something Harold considered unnecessary. By the summer of 2010, their arguments had escalated. Ruby had hinted to friends that she was tired of living under Harold's rules, that she wanted to use their savings for something meaningful before it was too late. Harold, on the other hand, grew increasingly suspicious. He began to believe Ruby was hiding money from him, skimming small amounts from their accounts to spend in ways he couldn't control. In truth, Ruby had occasionally tucked away cash for small indulgences, a new pair of shoes, a lunch with friends she didn't want to justify. But to Harold, this was an unforgivable betrayal. On the night of August 15th, the simmering conflict reached its breaking point. Investigators later pieced together what happened. Harold confronted Ruby in the kitchen after discovering she had withdrawn several $100s without telling him. She tried to explain that she was saving to take their grandchildren to the zoo, something she thought would bring joy to the family. But Harold didn't believe her. He accused her of lying, of undermining the careful system he had built for decades. The argument turned vicious, with Ruby threatening to leave if Harold couldn't let go of his obsession. In a fit of rage, Harold retrieved a revolver he kept locked in a cabinet. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices followed by a single, deafening gunshot. When police arrived hours later, called by a worried friend who couldn't reach Ruby, they found her slumped in a kitchen chair, fatally shot in the chest. Harold sat nearby, calm, the revolver resting on the counter. He told officers plainly, "She ruined everything. She was taking my money." The motive stunned even seasoned detectives. Harold insisted during questioning that the murder wasn't about anger, but about principle. He explained that Ruby's spending habits were destroying the order of things, that he couldn't tolerate what he called her financial betrayal. In his mind, the act wasn't impulsive. It was a twisted attempt to preserve the system he valued above his marriage, above even Ruby's life. The trial drew widespread attention in Kansas. Prosecutors painted Harold as a man who valued control so obsessively that he killed his wife rather than live with the discomfort of compromise. They emphasized how Ruby had lived for decades under Harold's rigid financial monitoring, slowly losing her independence. The defense argued diminished capacity, suggesting Harold's obsessive tendencies bordered on mental illness, that he had lost touch with reality and acted in a delusional state. But the jury saw the case differently. They saw a man who had chosen control over compassion, numbers over a human life. In 2011, Harold Brooks was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison, effectively a life sentence given his age. He showed little emotion at sentencing, maintaining that he had done what was necessary to stop Ruby from ruining everything. The community was shaken. For neighbors who had known Harold and Ruby as a quiet, ordinary couple, the crime was almost impossible to process. People struggled with the idea that decades of companionship and shared history could end in such violence over something as mundane as money. Friends of Ruby remembered her laughter, her kindness, her generosity, and they grieved the life cut short, not by a stranger, but by the man she had trusted most. The Brooks murder became a haunting reminder that motives for violence aren't always rooted in greed, jealousy, or revenge. Sometimes they emerge from obsessions so small, so seemingly trivial that they defy logic. In Harold's case, it was numbers in a ledger, figures on a page, the illusion of control slipping through his fingers. That obsession consumed him until the person he had lived beside for 40 years became, in his mind, an enemy. Looking back, investigators and psychologists called the case one of the strangest they had seen. The question lingered long after Harold's conviction: how does someone value a system of records more than the life of their spouse? For Ruby's family, the question will never have an answer that brings peace. Her children refused to speak to their father again, leaving him to spend the rest of his life in prison, alone with the notebooks he once believed could make sense of the world. The tragedy of Harold and Ruby Brooks revealed not just the fragility of human relationships, but the terrifying power of obsession. It showed how the ordinary routines of daily life can twist into something dangerous when control becomes more important than love. In the end, Ruby's greatest crime, in Harold's eyes, wasn't theft or betrayal. It was daring to live freely outside the confines of his endless records, and for that she paid with her life. In 1994, a small farming town in Ohio was stunned when a man named Daniel "Danny" Hargrove murdered his longtime friend and neighbor William "Bill" Keating. At first, the case seemed like a tragic but straightforward act of violence, the kind born from simmering resentment between neighbors. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a motive so unusual, so oddly specific, that it left even seasoned detectives shaking their heads in disbelief. Danny had killed Bill over a lawnmower, The Hargroves and Keatings had lived side by side for over 20 years. Their families were friendly, sharing meals, lending tools, and helping each other with farm chores. Danny and Bill were both in their 50s, hard-working men who had built their lives on land passed down through generations. By all accounts, they got along well enough, though there were occasional disputes over property lines and noise, typical disagreements that neighbors learned to tolerate. But one object sat at the center of their slow-brewing conflict: a bright red riding lawnmower. Bill had purchased it a few years earlier, and it quickly became a source of envy for Danny. Danny's mower was old, constantly breaking down, and every time he watched Bill glide across his yard with ease, resentment grew. He began borrowing Bill's mower under the pretense of mechanical trouble, at first with Bill's permission. But soon Bill grew tired of the repeated requests. He told Danny to fix his own machine and stop relying on him. Danny didn't take it well. Over the following months, the friendship soured. Danny began making sarcastic comments about Bill's fancy toys to neighbors. He complained that Bill was selfish, that a true friend wouldn't deny him the use of something so simple. Bill, meanwhile, felt Danny was taking advantage of his generosity. Their wives noticed the growing tension, but no one believed it would amount to anything more than a cold shoulder or a few harsh words. On the morning of May 19th, 1994, the feud reached its breaking point. Danny's mower had once again broken down, leaving his lawn half-cut. Frustrated, he walked over to Bill's property and demanded the use of the red mower. Bill refused, telling him bluntly, "It's not my job to take care of your yard." Witnesses later testified that Bill's tone was harsher than usual, fed by years of irritation. The argument escalated quickly, turning into shouting that carried across the neighborhood. Danny stormed back to his house, but instead of cooling off, he grabbed a shotgun from his closet, loaded it, and returned to Bill's yard. Bill was standing near the mower, still muttering angrily. Without hesitation, Danny raised the weapon and fired. The blast struck Bill in the chest, killing him instantly. Danny stood over his neighbor's body for several moments, gripping the shotgun before walking back home as if nothing had happened. When police arrived minutes later, called by horrified neighbors, they found Danny sitting calmly on his porch. His only words to the officers were chillingly simple: "He wouldn't let me use it." The motive shocked investigators. Neighbors struggled to comprehend how a decades-long friendship could unravel into murder over something as trivial as a lawnmower. Reporters seized on the absurdity of the case, dubbing it the lawnmower murder, a nickname that followed the trial for months. But behind the strange motive lay something deeper: years of resentment, envy, and bruised pride that had quietly festered until it erupted in violence. At trial, prosecutors portrayed Danny as a man whose jealousy turned deadly. They argued that the lawnmower was only the symbol of a much larger issue, that Danny could not stand to see his neighbor succeed where he had failed. The defense, on the other hand, claimed Danny had acted in a sudden fit of passion, overcome by anger after years of humiliation. They urged the jury to consider manslaughter instead of murder. The courtroom was packed each day, filled with townspeople who had known both men for decades. Many couldn't reconcile the Danny they remembered, a quiet, dependable farmer, with the man who had gunned down his friend in broad daylight. The prosecution presented the shotgun testimony from neighbors, and evidence of the long-standing disputes. There was no question Danny had pulled the trigger. The only question was why. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning a verdict of guilty on second-degree murder. Danny was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He showed little emotion as the sentence was read, simply nodding his head as though he had expected the outcome. In the aftermath, the town struggled to make sense of what had happened. Bill's family was left devastated, mourning a man who had spent his life working the land and providing for his loved ones. Danny's family, too, was shattered. His wife and children, blindsided by his sudden act of violence, found themselves ostracized in a community that could not forgive or forget. Psychologists who later studied the case pointed to Danny's growing resentment and feelings of inadequacy. The lawnmower was not just a tool, it was a symbol of status, pride, and independence. For Danny, being denied access to it felt like a public humiliation, an insult to his manhood and worth. In his fractured reasoning, killing Bill was not just about the machine. It was about reclaiming power and a friendship that had turned into rivalry. The case has lingered in memory because of its bizarre motive. It serves as a chilling reminder that violence does not always stem from grand betrayals or dramatic conflicts. Sometimes it arises from the smallest slights, the pettiest resentments magnified over years until they explode. In this case, the spark was a riding lawnmower, an object so mundane that it seemed impossible it could lead to murder. And yet, in one quiet Ohio town, it did. Decades later, when people there talk about the tragedy, they still shake their heads at the absurdity. But beneath the absurd lies something darker, the realization that ordinary lives can conceal dangerous obsessions, and that even the most trivial conflicts can spiral into irreversible acts of violence. In 2003, in the small town of Independence, Missouri, a 28-year-old woman named Sarah Johnson was found murdered in her modest one-bedroom apartment. What made the crime so disturbing wasn't just her age or the brutality of the act, but the motive that drove the killer. Sarah wasn't targeted for money, revenge, or jealousy. She was killed because she had borrowed a DVD and forgot to return it. Sarah was known among her friends as easygoing, fun, and a little scatterbrained. She worked at a diner on the edge of town, loved movies, and often invited friends over to watch them on her small television. She didn't have much money, but she loved lending and borrowing DVDs with neighbors, a casual exchange that for most people was no more than a simple courtesy. Among her circle of acquaintances was 31-year-old Michael Reeves, a man with a reputation for being odd and easily agitated. Michael lived 2 doors down, unemployed, spending most of his time watching films and obsessing over his collection of movies, which he treated with unusual intensity. Michael prided himself on owning hundreds of DVDs organized alphabetically and kept in pristine condition. Neighbors later said he would talk at length about his collection, reciting trivia about each film as though they were treasures. He disliked lending them out, but he occasionally made exceptions. When Sarah asked to borrow a copy of his prized Reservoir Dogs DVD, he reluctantly agreed. That single decision, trivial to most, became the spark that ignited a tragedy. Weeks passed, and Sarah hadn't returned the disc. She had watched it, mentioned to a friend that it was kind of cool, but forgot to bring it back to Michael. To her, it was nothing more than a borrowed movie. To Michael, it was an insult, a violation of trust, and a personal attack on the order he so carefully maintained. According to investigators, Michael began leaving notes on Sarah's door, first polite reminders, then angry demands. He confronted her in the hallway, insisting she return the DVD immediately. Sarah, overwhelmed by work and her personal life, laughed off his intensity, telling friends he was overreacting about nothing. But Michael didn't see it that way. In his mind, Sarah was disrespecting him, diminishing the value of something he considered sacred. On the night of September 14th, neighbors heard raised voices coming from Sarah's apartment. Michael had confronted her again, demanding the DVD. Sarah reportedly told him she had misplaced it and would look for it in the morning. That answer, so casual and dismissive, was the breaking point. Michael forced his way inside, grabbed a kitchen knife, and attacked her. The struggle was violent and brief. Sarah was stabbed multiple times and left on the floor of her living room, her blood soaking into the carpet. Michael fled back to his apartment, where police found him hours later, pacing amid his shelves of DVDs. The copy of Reservoir Dogs was sitting neatly on his coffee table. The investigation was swift. Witnesses heard the argument. Security cameras showed Michael entering Sarah's apartment, and the murder weapon was found with his fingerprints. When questioned, Michael admitted to the killing, but offered a justification that stunned detectives. He said Sarah had disrespected him, that she had stolen something priceless from his collection by failing to return it. He claimed he had given her plenty of chances, but she had mocked him and dismissed his concerns. To Michael, the DVD wasn't just a disc, it was part of his identity, and Sarah's carelessness was unforgivable. At trial, the prosecution emphasized the senselessness of the crime. They portrayed Michael as a man whose obsession with his possessions outweighed his regard for human life. They showed jurors the notes he had written to Sarah, each more frantic and aggressive than the last, building a picture of a man consumed by an object. The defense argued that Michael suffered from untreated mental illness, that his obsessive personality had distorted reality until he saw Sarah as an enemy. But the jury was unmoved. In 2004, Michael Reeves was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He reportedly showed little remorse, telling reporters during a prison interview that Sarah had brought it on herself by ignoring his requests. His words only deepened the horror for Sarah's grieving family, who couldn't understand how something as trivial as a DVD could become a matter of life and death. Sarah's death left a permanent scar on the community. Friends remembered her as light-hearted and warm, someone who never imagined her small oversight could cost her life. The case became a symbol of the dangers of obsession, of how petty grievances can become magnified in unstable minds until they lead to irreversible acts. For years afterward, locals would shake their heads always whenever they passed Sarah's old apartment building. They would talk about how ordinary everything had seemed, how no one would have guessed that such a minor conflict could end in bloodshed. Some neighbors admitted feeling guilty, recalling the notes Michael had left and his erratic behavior, wondering if they could have intervened before it escalated. The DVD murder as it came to be known in the press, was remembered not because of its brutality, but because of its banality. It revealed something terrifying about human nature, that not all motives are rational or understandable, and that sometimes violence erupts not from grand passions, but from the smallest and most meaningless sparks. Sarah Johnson never returned that DVD. In the end, it wasn't just a piece of plastic in a case. It became the symbol of an obsession that destroyed two lives: Sarah's, cut short in her prime, and Michael's, condemned to spend the rest of his days behind bars, surrounded not by the collection he worshipped, but by cold, concrete walls. In 2012, the small town of Clarksville, Tennessee, was shaken by the brutal murder of 42-year-old nurse Linda Graham, a woman admired in her community for her compassion and steady presence. Her patients described her as someone who made them feel safe, who always brought calm into even the most frightening situations. Friends knew her as dependable, loving, and endlessly patient. That made her death not only devastating, but incomprehensible when the true motive emerged. Linda wasn't killed by a stranger or in the course of a robbery. She was murdered by her younger sister, Karen, over an inheritance dispute that came down to something as petty as a set of antique teacups. Linda and Karen had grown up in the same modest household, the daughters of a factory worker and a school teacher. Their parents raised them with traditional values, emphasizing family loyalty and responsibility. But the two sisters could not have been more different. Linda, the elder, was steady and nurturing, often helping care for Karen as children. Karen, 3 years younger, was fiery, impulsive, and prone to jealousy. Family members recalled how Karen often felt overshadowed by her sister's accomplishments, resentful of the praise Linda received for her grades, her nursing career, and later her role as a mother. When their parents passed away within a few years of each other, the sisters inherited the family home and its contents. Most of the estate was modest, but their mother had left behind a collection of antique china teacups, each delicately painted, passed down through generations. Linda, the teacups were sentimental. She remembered drinking cocoa with her mother from them on special occasions. To Karen, however, they were valuable. She believed they were worth thousands of dollars and insisted they should be hers. For months, the sisters argued. Linda wanted to keep the teacups in the family, not sell them. Karen accused her of being selfish, of hoarding what should be shared. Their arguments grew more heated, spilling into phone calls and family gatherings. Relatives urged them to find a compromise, but bitterness had already taken root. By the spring of 2012, Karen's resentment had hardened into something darker. On the evening of June 8th, Linda returned home from a late shift at the hospital. She was tired, carrying her bag, and ready to collapse into bed. As she entered the kitchen, Karen was waiting for her. She had let herself into the house using a spare key. Linda was startled, but before she could react, the argument began again. Karen demanded the teacups, insisting she was done being ignored. Linda refused, telling her sister she needed to leave before things got out of hand. But Karen had come prepared. In her purse, she carried a hammer. The confrontation escalated into violence. Karen struck Linda multiple times, the blows echoing through the quiet house. Linda collapsed to the floor, mortally wounded. In her final moments, she reportedly whispered her sister's name, as though still in disbelief that Karen could be the one attacking her. Karen fled the house, leaving Linda's body behind in the kitchen. It was Linda's teenage son who discovered her the next morning when he returned from a friend's house. The scene was horrifying. He called police immediately, his voice shaking, as he told dispatchers that his mother was on the floor and not moving. Investigators quickly determined the death was not the result of a break-in. Nothing of value had been stolen, and there were no signs of forced entry. Suspicion soon turned toward Karen, who had a well-known feud with her sister. When questioned, Karen initially denied involvement, but as evidence mounted, her fingerprints on the hammer, her car spotted near Linda's home the night of the murder, her story unraveled. Confronted with the evidence, she admitted to the killing but downplayed her responsibility. She told detectives she just lost control, that the argument over the teacups had pushed her past her breaking point. The trial drew national attention not because of its brutality, but because of the astonishing motive. Prosecutors argued that Karen had killed Linda not out of necessity, but out of greed and jealousy that had festered since childhood. They painted her as a woman who could not stand her sister's success and resented being left behind. The defense claimed diminished capacity, pointing to Karen's unstable mental health and history of impulsive behavior. But the jury was unmoved by her excuses. In 2013, Karen Graham was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. She wept as the verdict was read, but her tears did little to soften the public's anger. Family members were devastated, forced to confront the unimaginable, one daughter dead, the other condemned to a lifetime behind bars. The aftermath left scars on the community. Friends of Linda struggled to comprehend how such a caring, selfless woman could be killed over something so trivial. Patients at the hospital where she worked left flowers and cards at the entrance, remembering her kindness. Her son, traumatized by the discovery of her body, withdrew from public life, grappling with a loss that could never be repaired. The antique teacups, the object at the heart of the crime, were recovered by investigators. They were appraised and found to be worth far less than Karen had imagined, only a few $100s. The revelation made the tragedy even harder to bear. Linda had lost her life, and Karen had lost her freedom over objects that were nearly worthless in monetary terms. The story of the Graham sisters is remembered as a chilling example of how jealousy and obsession can warp family bonds into something deadly. It showed that sometimes the things we think are trivial, the possessions, the heirlooms, the slights, can become symbols of something much deeper: resentment, insecurity, and unresolved rivalry. For Karen, the teacups weren't just porcelain. They represented everything she believed she had been denied, every slight she thought she had suffered. And in the end, she destroyed the sister who had loved her because of it. Years later, people in Clarksville still talk about the case in hushed tones. They recall Linda's smile, her quiet strength, her dedication to her family. They shake their heads at the idea that a set of dishes could cost someone their life, but beneath the absurdity lies something terrifyingly human: the capacity for envy to curdle into hatred, and for hatred to drive even sisters bound by blood to unthinkable acts of violence. In 1998, in the town of Laredo, Texas, a murder unfolded that left investigators baffled not just by its brutality, but by the astonishing motive behind it. The victim, a 23-year-old man named Javier Morales Avay, was known around his neighborhood as friendly, easygoing, and perhaps a little too trusting. He worked part-time at a grocery store, played basketball at the local park, and lived with his mother and younger sister in a modest house. Javier had no enemies, no history of trouble with the law. That's why, when he was found beaten to death behind the grocery store where he worked, the community was left in shock. The crime scene told a story of rage. Javier had been lured to the back alley late at night, where he was struck multiple times with a blunt object. His body showed signs of repeated blows far beyond what was necessary to kill. Police initially suspected a robbery gone wrong, but Javier's wallet, phone, and jewelry were all still on him. Nothing had been taken. The motive wasn't theft, it was something far stranger. Within days, suspicion fell on a co-worker, 22-year-old Carlos Vega. Carlos had worked alongside Javier at the grocery store for more than a year. He was quiet, reserved, often described as awkward. Co-workers said he seemed harmless, though he could be moody. When police interviewed him, he admitted to seeing Javier that night, but claimed he left before anything happened. But inconsistencies in his story drew attention, and when investigators searched Carlos's apartment, they found evidence that would shock everyone. Inside his small, cluttered room, detectives uncovered a stack of notebooks filled with obsessive writings about Javier. Carlos had documented Javier's daily activities in disturbing detail: what time he arrived at work, what he ate for lunch, who he spoke to, even when he laughed. Alongside the notes were dozens of crude sketches of Javier's face and body, drawn again and again with strange annotations. Some pages contained angry rants accusing Javier of stealing attention and mocking him. Others were chillingly reverent, calling Javier perfect and untouchable. The most disturbing discovery was the motive Carlos himself confessed to during interrogation. He claimed he killed Javier because Javier wouldn't stop humming. At work, Javier often passed the time by humming songs while stocking shelves or bagging groceries. To Carlos, this harmless habit became unbearable. In his mind, Javier's humming was a deliberate taunt, a reminder of his own isolation. Carlos told investigators, "He knew it bothered me. He wouldn't stop. He wanted me to feel small." Friends and co-workers were stunned. They remembered Javier's humming as absent-minded, cheerful, the kind of thing that made long shifts easier. Nobody believed he did it to provoke anyone, but Carlos's resentment had grown quietly for months. Each note in his journals revealed how he fixated on the humming until it consumed him. He described it as mockery disguised as music, convinced Javier was doing it intentionally. By the time he lured Javier to the alley, Carlos wasn't just angry. He believed he was silencing torment. The trial became a media sensation, not because Javier was a public figure, but because the motive seemed so incomprehensible. Reporters called it the humming murder, a case that blurred the line between obsession and delusion. Prosecutors painted Carlos as a young man whose simmering jealousy and social isolation twisted into lethal obsession. They argued that the humming was never the issue. It was Javier's very existence, his easy charm and effortless warmth that Carlos couldn't stand. The defense presented a different picture. They described Carlos as mentally ill, suffering from paranoia and obsessive tendencies that went untreated. Psychologists testified that he fixated on Javier as a scapegoat for all his insecurities, magnifying a trivial habit into something intolerable. They argued that Carlos did not fully understand the consequences of his actions, urging the jury to consider insanity. But the jury wasn't persuaded. The brutality of the attack, the months of obsessive documentation, and Carlos's own admission sealed his fate. In 1999, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. For Javier's family, the verdict brought little comfort. His mother wept during the proceedings, describing her son as a light in their lives, someone who never sought conflict. She couldn't fathom how something as small as humming could lead to such horror. His sister, just 16 at the time, later said that the silence in their home after Javier's death was unbearable, that she sometimes caught herself waiting to hear his cheerful humming in the kitchen. The community of Laredo struggled with the case for years. People who had worked with both men replayed their memories, wondering if they had overlooked signs of Carlos's instability. Co-workers remembered moments when Carlos would glare at Javier or leave the room when he started humming, but no one thought it was dangerous. It was only after the crime that the pieces fit together into a chilling pattern of obsession. Even now, criminologists cite the case as an example of how seemingly insignificant behaviors can become deadly triggers in the minds of unstable individuals. The humming was never the true cause. It was the symbol of everything Carlos felt he lacked. Javier's easy confidence, his kindness, even his absent-minded joy became unbearable reminders of Carlos's own isolation. And so, in the distorted logic of obsession, Carlos convinced himself that silencing Javier would also silence his own torment. But it didn't. In prison interviews, Carlos admitted that the humming never really stopped. He claimed he could still hear it in his head, echoing endlessly. Psychologists noted this as evidence of his disordered mind, but for the public, it was simply haunting, a reminder that the crime had achieved nothing but destruction. The murder of Javier Morales remains one of the most chilling examples of an unbelievable motive. It showed how a harmless habit, something as small as a song hummed under one's breath, could become twisted into a trigger for unimaginable violence. It left behind a grieving family, a shattered community, and a permanent reminder that even the smallest details of human behavior can carry deadly weight in the wrong mind. In 2011, the quiet suburban town of Brampton, Ontario, was rocked by a murder so perplexing that even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend it. The victim was 42-year-old Margaret Turner, a school teacher known for her kindness and patience in the classroom. She had taught generations of local children and was remembered for the way she made even the shyest students feel comfortable. Her colleagues called her gentle but firm, a woman who believed deeply in discipline tempered by compassion. Margaret lived a modest life, renting a 2-bedroom house with her teenage son, and she was well liked by neighbors. So when she was found dead in her own home one Sunday morning, brutally stabbed more than 20 times, the community could barely process what had happened. At first, investigators suspected a burglary. The back window had been shattered, glass scattered across the floor, but nothing appeared to be stolen. Her purse, wallet, and jewelry were untouched. Her laptop sat on the kitchen counter. There was no sign of forced entry at the front door, leading police to suspect that the window had been broken after the fact, staged to mislead them. The violence of the attack suggested something personal, not a random crime, and soon suspicion turned to someone nobody in the community would have ever imagined. The prime suspect was one of Margaret's own students, a 17-year-old named Daniel Holt. Daniel had been in her English class for nearly a year. He wasn't considered a troublemaker, though teachers described him as distant and sometimes hostile when challenged. He had few friends, kept mostly to himself, and spent long hours at the library on his own. Margaret had taken a particular interest in him, encouraging him to participate in class and offering extra help when he struggled with assignments. To her colleagues, it was typical of her, always going the extra mile for her students. But in Daniel's mind, her attention had taken on a different, darker meaning. When detectives first questioned Daniel, he claimed he barely knew her outside of class, but inconsistencies in his story and the discovery of his fingerprints at the crime scene unraveled his defense. When pressed, Daniel admitted he had been inside Margaret's house on the night of the murder. What shocked investigators wasn't just the confession, but the motive he revealed. He had killed her because she gave him a B- on an essay. It sounded impossible at first, a grade sparking such brutality. But when police dug deeper, they discovered the full scope of Daniel's obsession. In his bedroom, officers found notebooks filled with rants about Margaret, written in sprawling, angry handwriting. He accused her of ruining his future and humiliating him in front of classmates. One page read, "She thinks she can decide what I'm worth. She can't. Nobody can." Another, more chillingly, declared, "If she won't recognize my brilliance, she doesn't deserve to exist." It turned out that Daniel had been harboring resentment for months. He saw Margaret's attempts to help him not as kindness, but as condescension. Each grade she gave him became, in his mind, a judgment on his worth as a person. When he received the B- on an essay he had poured his energy into, Daniel spiraled. He convinced himself she was deliberately sabotaging him, keeping him from reaching the academic recognition he believed he deserved. His anger turned obsessive, and within weeks he was plotting revenge. On the night of the murder, Daniel waited until Margaret's son was staying over at a friend's house. He approached her home, knocked on the door under the pretense of needing to discuss an assignment, and when she let him in, he attacked. The brutality of the stabbing shocked even the investigators who had seen countless crimes. It wasn't just murder. It was an explosion of rage, every wound reflecting his distorted belief that she had wronged him. Afterward, he broke the back window in an attempt to stage a burglary, then fled. The trial captured national attention, both for its tragic details and its unsettling motive, and prosecutors painted Daniel as a young man consumed by entitlement, someone who couldn't tolerate failure and turned violent when faced with it. They emphasized the premeditation, the notebooks, the planning, the staging of the scene. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion, they argued, but a calculated act born of obsession. The defense, meanwhile, argued that Daniel suffered from severe mental illness. Psychiatrists testified that he displayed traits of narcissistic personality disorder and delusional thinking. They claimed he saw Margaret not as a teacher trying to help him, but as an adversary standing in the way of his imagined success. His sense of grievance had grown into a paranoid conviction that killing her was the only way to take back control. Ultimately, the jury rejected the insanity defense. Daniel was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. For Margaret's family, the verdict brought justice but little solace. Her son, devastated, spoke at the sentencing hearing about losing not just a mother but the sense of safety in his own home. She cared about her students more than anyone, he said, his voice breaking. She saw potential in people even when they didn't see it in themselves. That's who she was. The case left the community shaken. Teachers who had once brushed off students' complaints as routine began to reevaluate how much resentment could fester unnoticed. Parents worried about the pressures placed on teenagers about how entitlement and fragile self-esteem could twist into violence. And for the students who had sat in Margaret's class, the memory of her death was a scar that would never fully fade. Criminologists later cited the case as a disturbing example of how disproportionate motives can mask deeper psychological fractures. The grade itself wasn't the cause, it was the spark that ignited a powder keg of insecurity, entitlement, and untreated mental illness. What made the crime so haunting was the way something so small, a single grade on a single assignment, was magnified into a justification for murder. To this day, the murder of Margaret Turner is remembered not only for its senseless brutality, but for the question it leaves behind. How could such an ordinary act of teaching, the simple task of grading an essay, become the catalyst for a killing? It serves as a chilling reminder of how fragile the line can be between frustration and violence when twisted through the lens of obsession